Um, do you get yours off? Welcome to this evening's general membership meeting, and we are so happy to have our guest speaker with us this evening to talk about reform or defund the police. And our guest speaker is Kristin Romaine-Blochowski, and she has had a phenomenal background, and her current background is equally phenomenal. She is currently a professor at Lourdes University, teaching criminal and social justice. She's also on the diversity, equity, and inclusion team. She is a former FBI agent, police officer, and she is a lawyer. She currently teaches classes such as constitutional law, civil rights, the justice system, communication, and conflict management and social problems. I am very happy to introduce Kristin Romaine-Blochowski.
All right, hello. This is, I forgot to open my water here. This is going to be different here, kind of like teaching during COVID where I had students here and students here. But I'm going to share my screen. And of course, when you share it on Zoom, your notes are not visible in the PowerPoint. So I will be, I'll be fine. All right, so today, police and the community, is reform needed? The discussion of defund the police, we'll mention that as well. It's one of those controversial words that we need to talk about. First, I want to make it clear. I support police who protect and serve. I support Black Lives Matter. I support police reform to make sure all officers protect and serve and know that Black Lives Matter. So that's me in that little X. We seem to think in our society of the last few years that you have to be one or the other, and you don't. You can support the police and support the other ideas. So just so you know where I am. So this idea of defund the police, when we hear it, the first thing everybody thinks of is, do we want to eliminate the police, take away all their money? And that's not what defund the police originally meant. It meant that we wanted to change where some of that funding went to. It seems like every societal issue that has not been dealt with has been put on police. And that is too much for them to deal with. The job of policing is very difficult. So when we talk about defunding, put some of that money towards the underlying causes of crime to prevent it. And then also allow the police to focus on protecting and serving rather than being reactional to all the things that are happening. So when I look at this issue, I look at two basic issues that are a problem right now. We have historically negative relationships with the African-American community that have continued on to present day. In addition, there are police officers that are misusing force against the community members that the community then calls police brutality, and that force is disproportionately against the Black community. You'll see that word disproportionately a lot. Just remember when we say that, the Black community is about 13% of the population. White community is 55 up to 60. So when we look at the numbers, we're doing them in proportion to that population. All right, where'd my little arrow go? Okay, so these negative relationships between police and the African-American community go all the way back to slavery. Slave patrols were truly one of the first police officers in the country. They returned fugitive slaves. They made sure that the formerly enslaved were not meeting and congregating and trying to overthrow their masters. The police also took part in the enforcement of Black codes shortly after the end of the Civil War and Jim Crow enforcement. So all of the laws that we know that were horrible, that impacted the Black community, were enforced by police. They also participated and did not stop many of the lynchings that happened around the country. Lynching was a way to enforce white supremacy, and it was done as almost a festival, a picnic-like atmosphere. An individual was said to be lynched in this evening, and the community would all come out. They'd take pictures and send postcards. And often you can see the law enforcement officers standing in there smiling. Additionally, oftentimes what would happen is the individuals who were planning on doing the lynching would be given the individual who was going to be hung by the police. So this has not been a historically good relationship. In 1968, the Kerner Commission, well, there were some riots that were happening right before the civil rights movement, during the civil rights movement, and one of the big ones happened in Detroit. It's been labeled a riot. It was a protest turned riot, but we'll talk about that language in a minute. But the Kerner Commission, one of their big conclusions was that our nation is moving toward two societies, one Black and one white, separate and unequal. And this was ignored. It was truly ignored. The relationship between law enforcement and the Black community from the civil rights era on included protesting that the media often referred to as rioting, insurrections, terrorism, that's a misspelling, and I thought I caught all of those. Looting, civil unrest, when these things started out as protests. Classifying civil rights activists as dangerous. The FBI classified Martin Luther King Jr. as dangerous and had files that he was researching these individuals. Civil rights protests were turned into riots, oftentimes by the behavior of police officers themselves, by going into a peaceful crowd and riling them up by hitting them or trying to arrest them for no reason. Many things would happen. The use of canines, the use of fire hoses. We've seen it through all of the pictures in the civil rights movement. We then moved into the 80s and the 90s with the war on drugs, and there was a disparity between crack and powdered cocaine in the sentencing. It was a tiny amount of, or a large amount of powdered cocaine was the same sentencing as a small amount of crack cocaine. And unfortunately, that was, it was seen in the arrests where crack cocaine was less expensive. It was sold in the communities where there would be more poverty. And in our country, unfortunately, it's still the case. Many of those areas of poverty are disproportionately Black. Mass incarceration, the war on drugs, and then also 3 strikes laws, this tough on crime attitude really caused our prison populations to skyrocket. And then racial profiling, we know about how it was handled in New York. Rudy Giuliani is often viewed as this mayor who made New York wonderful. He also allowed racial profiling through this use of broken windows policing, where most of the Black communities were over-policed. Individuals were stopped without reasonable suspicion. They were stopped for suspicion, and that's not a legal term. And it was found to be unconstitutional, and it was mainly against the Black and brown communities. And then a disproportionate use of force has continued to happen, as started out with slave patrols up to the current day. Look at Tyree Nichols, one of the most recent blatant use of force by police against an African-American young man. So when we look at some numbers, the police killed over 1,000 citizens in 2022. When we look at those numbers, it's 7,200 since 2015. Now, I will tell you, there is no database where you can look this up by any national organization. Each department may do that separately. The FBI in 2019 began collecting that information, but it is voluntary. The police departments do not have to give that information. And then just to note, law enforcement officers killed or assaulted that database with the FBI began in 1996. Just a little bit of difference there. One way that you can find this information is looking at the Washington Post website, Fatal Encounters, the Mapping Violence website. So I often look at those and compare the information to try and get a data set. This is 2015 to 2022. If you look at this column right here, this is the Black community, 5.8 per million per year. Black citizens were killed, where 2.3 million per million per year were killed. So that 5.8 versus 2.3, that is extremely disproportionate, negatively against the Black community. So look at some solutions. Being a former police officer, I try not to speak through my experience, but I can't help but have some of that come through this. I try and talk about it through the lens of the research that I've done, but I saw things. So, current requirements are an individual has to be over 21 and a high school graduate. You can look at the rest of those. I don't have a problem. U.S. citizen, clean background, physically fit. Disqualifications, high drug use, committing violent crimes, DUIs, and then lying. If you lie on your application or you lie during a polygraph, that will disqualify you. This is just kind of for your information, the process. You have to meet those basic requirements. And then there's an initial test, basically a reading, writing, math type test. There's a background investigation, a panel interview, a physical, a fitness test, and a psychological evaluation. I put some little stars by that and changed the color because I'm hoping to do some research into the psychological evaluation because I believe there needs to be some changes in that. The basic information that I've found says that they're trying to make sure that you are a sturdy person that can handle the job and that you can handle all the things that come along, like maybe seeing an individual who has been beat up or a rape victim or a dead body. But there needs to be a little bit more than that in this evaluation, and I'm hoping to do some research on that in the future. So I'm not touching that today. Current training. The academy training, police and corrections personnel, they have basic functions, basic laws, basic skills just for entry level into the position. And it's a minimum of 600 hours in Ohio. Then there's field training where you have a field training officer who hopefully you will get a good one who trains you the right way. And you have them for about the first year on the job. Just to note, to be a cosmetologist in the state of Ohio, you need 1,500 hours, okay? But to be a police officer, you only need 600. I find that humorous as well. Yes, 1,500 to mess up my hair. Yeah. Or 600 and you carry a gun and can basically take someone's life. Yeah. The next two slides are just some basics of what the academies are teaching. We see a lot of legal, which is good, but we don't really know how to use that legal until we're out on the street. So do you understand what reasonable suspicion is? Yes, I can tell you the definition, but when I'm out there, do I have reasonable suspicion? I'm not sure, you know? Civil disorder and riot formations. Yeah, those are extremely important. How often is there civil disorders and riots? Small towns. Think about big cities, okay, but think about most policing is done in, you know, the medium, small towns, not most policing, but a lot of policing. Do they need those subjects? Homeland security. Whoops. Homeland security. That's a federal issue, but 23 hours because we have to understand it. Patrol, traffic, investigation, firearms, driving, that's important. Subject control, patrol, tactics, traffic practicals. So these are some practical things. But when we look at the firearms, it's teaching you how to use the gun. It's not talking about when you should use it or if you should use it. The Lucas County Police Academy is taught at Owens. They're teaching things a little bit different. Their hours are a little bit different. There are certain required hours by the Ohio Police Officer Training Academy, but the academies themselves, the individual counties, can add to that. So again, a lot of law, a lot of procedures, not as much practical, hands-on, when do I use this? So that's the way it is. Now, this is just kind of an overview, these next two slides, of things that I have found that may be able to change policing. College education and age, the mentality, the Black history training, implicit bias training, focusing on integrity and getting rid of that blue coat of silence. I'll mention that a little bit. Constant scenario and use of force training. As a police officer, my continuing education was going out to the range and shooting my weapon, 50 yards, and then get closer and then closer. And then they teach you how to use your left hand. Well, I understand why. If my right hand's injured, I use my left hand. But it's more what I need is, when should I use that weapon? Changing police duties. This is where we're talking about that defund the police, changing priorities, changing from those mental health calls, drug enforcement, warrant service, traffic enforcement. Now, traffic enforcement we think of as the basis of policing in our communities, but it's one of the most dangerous things that police officers do. And then I could talk about this for a long time, but school resource officers, don't get me wrong, there are some really good ones, but unfortunately what the research has shown is that it increases the school to prison pipeline, meaning juveniles are getting into the system earlier since school resource officers have been in the schools and then continuing that life crime. So how do we change the requirements and training? So professional requirements. August Vollmer in 1918, he was a police chief. They call him the father of professional policing. He had it down. He knew what we needed to do. He said every officer should have a college degree. We still don't require that. We will hire individuals with no higher education at all. I kind of skipped that next. He talked about profession versus a job. A profession has specialized education and training. A job, you just go and you get paid money. We need to make policing more of a profession. And right now, that bill that is proposing that 18-year-olds be police officers, that is a hard no. The FBI, whoops, there it goes.
You're still on, so you keep
okay. The FBI, the minimum is 23. I joke with my students all the time about the fact that we really need to have every single thing that requires you to be an adult should be 25. That's what the research says when our, prefrontal cortex is fully formed, but we allow them to go into the military and have guns and drive. They drive this how many ton vehicle at 15 and 16. That scares me. Drinking, everything. I told my sons, you will not be allowed to get into, a contractual marriage until you're 25. I will veto that, You want something different at 21 than you do at 25. So get to that age. And if we have that higher age, that college education will be easier as well. Overall, college-educated officers generate fewer complaints, are terminated less frequently for misconduct, and less likely to use verbal and/or physical force. 40% less likely to use force, 30% less likely to fire their weapons in the line of duty. In addition, I have had students come into my classroom and say, I never met a Black person till I came to college. And then they're going to be police officers in Cleveland or wherever. College educated. In addition, many programs require internships and service learning. 80% change their stereotypical assumptions, work on their implicit biases. There's increased moral reasoning, openness to diversity, more intercultural awareness to work better with the community. Critical thinking, problem solving. One thing that was not on my resume was I taught high school for many years. We're not teaching our kids how to think anymore. We're teaching them to memorize information, take a test, pass it, and move on. They need to know how to think. And they get to us in college and we have to start that all over. They can also identify quality information and scientific evidence. Science is real. They can also then evaluate the policies and practices that their departments are using. When I teach, I tell my students, you're not just going out there to do what they tell you. You're going out there to make a difference and change the system. Training priorities. One of the things, this is military. Looks like a military officer. Guardian versus warrior mentality. There is an us versus them attitude out there, that it is the police against society. It shows in the uniforms, it shows in basic treatment. And I'm telling you, when I was in the FBI Academy and in the police academy, everyone wants to hurt you or kill you. That's how we're taught. And yeah, and there's no doubt you need to have awareness, everything that's going on. But I also worked at Starbucks for about 1.5 years in between my high school teaching and my college teaching. And their attitude, their mantra is assume good intentions. And I think policing needs to do that. Assume good intentions until they show you differently. You always need to be aware, but don't assume that every single person is trying to kill you. That will also lead to changing what police officers are investigating. If we look at the statistics from 2022, police killed between 1,000 and 1,200 people. Traffic stops, mental health issues, disturbance calls, and nonviolent offenses were the highest level of incidences where individuals were killed. Officers were killed in basic patrol traffic duties, tactical operations like drug busts, serving warrants, where they got all their SWAT stuff on, and then domestic disputes. Domestic disputes are very volatile. So when we look at these priorities, the one that jumps out to me is the mental health issues. I've dealt with family members, a family member that has bipolar disorder. Unfortunately, I had a police officer that come to the house that was trained in mental health assistance. They're not all trained in mental health assistance. And unfortunately, what happens is an individual who's having a possibly mental health episode looks violent oftentimes. They're not, statistically, they're not. They're more likely to hurt themselves than somebody else. But to a police officer, that looks scary, and that's when force is often used. Get the police out of that. Have the fire respond, or mental health providers with the fire department. We can figure it out. It doesn't have to be police. But we started that when we got rid of all of the asylums and mental health. That was a bad situation, but we haven't fixed it. We haven't worked on it. Traffic stops. I am in no way promoting red light cameras or speed cameras at lights. No, I'm not. But when an officer is, for example, standing on an overpass and can use the gun to find a individual who is speeding, the police officer is still going to be able to verify that this individual is speeding without going up to the car and actually giving them a ticket. Okay. It's not fun to get that in the mail, but at least it's a police officer. Those red light cameras is some computer system that you're hoping is working right. My cars are registered, or my car is in my husband's name, and the other cars are in my name. So I can't tell you the number of those things that I've gotten that it wasn't me driving. Black history training, please tell me when I can talk a long time.
You're doing great. Good.
Black history training and implicit bias training, all of those things where I mentioned about from slave patrols on, when I teach that in my civil rights class, because civil rights for the Black community started in 1619 when they were first brought here to the United States. And so understanding that relationship is vital, is so important. Understanding that the Black community is not in some of the situations that they're in because of their bad choices, as many want to say, but because of policies that the United States has had, from slavery on to Jim Crow, on to the war on drugs, on to redlining. I could give an entire semester on redlining. We all build wealth through houses. If you're not able to buy houses in good areas, you're not going to build wealth. And then also teaching officers the concept of hidden or implicit bias. I was teaching a unit on that in my communications class a couple weeks ago, and I had a student, he's shaking his head. I said, what is going on? And he goes, that's not real. I said, you want to be a police officer, right? Yes, you better realize that it's real, number one. Number two, it's going to be real on the test, okay? Yeah, it's real on the test, and it's not Santa Claus. That's something you believe in, it's real. So we all have implicit bias. And again, I could talk about this forever, but the way we're raised, what we watch on television, the words people use around us, our families, are we rural, are we urban, where everything impacts our views on different things. Let's say you have a really bad experience with, I don't know, a young Hispanic kid. And now all of a sudden you've got this in the back of your head that, oh, young Hispanic kids, Hispanic. Ugh. And then the next time you come in contact with the Hispanic youth, your first inclination is to kind of jump back a little bit. So you kind of get that, it's your default. And it's not our fault. It's the way we've been raised, the things we've learned, and we all have it. But police officers need to understand it. They need to determine what their biases are, and they need to figure out how to overcome them. And unfortunately, in our society, a lot of the biases have come from the majority of us, which are the white community, which has been this idea that whites, we're the majority. Everything you see is from the white perspective. It was very rare that there were television shows that had an all-Black cast. Well, now you see that all the time. We're getting past those things. I remember growing up and the police officers on the TV shows were white and the criminals were Black. I can show you media coverage where a group of 5 white youth, their college pictures are shown when they commit a robbery, but 5 Black youth, their pictures from their booking are used. That makes us view the Black individuals as criminals. And this happens to us without us even knowing it. And police officers have to understand that because they are going to be policing in these communities. The blue silence is something that should be gone by now, but it's where police officers, we depend on each other. So if one of you does something wrong and I tell on you, you are no longer going to have my back. Okay, it is a system of loyalty and it causes problems. It allows officers to get away with things that they should not get away with. The officers that killed Tyree Nichols, if you look at their police reports, they all basically say the same thing. They said, you know, that they needed to use the level of force they did because of X, Y, and Z. They all said basically the same thing. Well, then we got that video from a camera that they did not realize was there while they were doing what they were doing, thinking they were off camera, and it told a completely different story. So we need to move from that blue code to this. A discussion of honesty and integrity needs to be in every academy. Additionally, police officers, I remember there was a sign in our police break room that talked about going and getting some like mental health help if you had, you know, responded to a severe scene and you needed to talk to somebody. Everyone was like, no way, they're going to put me on desk duty or whatever the case may be. There's this attitude, this mentality of I have to be tough. I can't show any weakness because I'm out there to enforce the law, even with the women. And we need to talk about mental health. We need to make sure that our officers are mentally healthy in every aspect. And so that stigma needs to get erased in the academy, and then it almost needs to be forced on the officers when they're out on the streets. We expect integrity. We expect our officers to be honest, and unfortunately, isn't always the case. When we look back at that training, we need to have constant scenario and use of force training. Police are taught how to use force. They're taught how to use that gun. They're taught self-defense. If someone's pulling away from you, what do you do? They are taught the basics of the law, the legal reasons for when they can search and when they can use force. But if you're not out there in that split second when you have to make that decision, what level of force do I use? Or can I do this search? Can I open the trunk? If you don't understand that because you haven't been through real scenarios, you're not going to know how to do it on the street. So in the academy, it needs to start. There are a lot of places that use those. There's a firearms training system that's a video. They use that in the FBI. And they did a lot more scenario training than many of the police academies are using.
10 minutes. Do you want to take any questions?
Oh, sure. I should have said, if you have a question, ask me during, but yes.
So it sounds like you're a wonderful instructor.
Well, thank you.
Teaching people who I assume are in law enforcement. Is that what their program is?
My students are criminal and social justice majors, so they want to get into the criminal justice system. They're not all law enforcement.
And they're not all going to be police.
No.
But it sounds like all police need your class.
I would love that.
and they need it in addition to what 600 hours they get in an academy.
Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, when a police officer, and I was this way as a teacher, you got to get your continuing education. And it's just like, okay, click, click, click through the computer. They don't always take it seriously. So when you're told, oh, you're going to get implicit bias training. Yeah. So it's rough. Yes.
I know in the schools, they used to have community coordinators, which were trained police officers who, did they get also extra trainings in the areas of working with the kids in the schools?
The school resource officers?
Repeat a question for the people online.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, like they were called community coordinators, and like policemen would be assigned to the Jefferson Center or Scott High School. Do they get other training besides their police training? I think they really need that to be able to work within that community.
They do.
Around school.
Yes. Do the community coordinators and school resource officers get additional training? They do get some more juvenile training, and they get some training on the reason behind why we need these officers or needed these officers. Unfortunately, one of the things is that the other students should never see one of their fellow students in handcuffs. Well, that went right down the drain because so many of these schools have such violent things happen. I have no problem with the school resource officers being involved in getting the individual under control, but they should bring in another officer to arrest the individual and drive them downtown, because that school resource officer, community coordinator, is then that relationship with the rest of the students is just ruined, but they don't have enough.
I think that more funding should be going into those areas at the youngest ages possible, and then maybe we'll have better success.
Yeah,
what's coming up.
It's definitely
example,
true.
My office was at the Jefferson Center
for
many years, and I dealt with people that nobody wanted anything to do with. And we were able to reach them by the police officers knowing more about the kids, that the kids can gain a better respect. More of that has to be done.
Yeah, those relationships. You're right. Those relationships need to be built. Yeah. And it definitely starts with the youth. When the community does not trust the police, they're not going to help solve crimes. Yeah. They're not going to talk to the police at all.
Years ago, we had the problem over the incidents on Dorr Street when there used to be stores there, and the police, Black Panthers was there, and the police and the Black Panthers crashed that whole community around that area, which involved Libby High School and stuff. People didn't understand what was going on. And so we need a lot more of the police becoming educated to explain to the public that they're not there.
Right. Right. Unfortunately, you have the FBI saying that they're terrorists. So yeah, it's hard. It's hard. Yes.
Do you see any change coming down the pike for the Toledo Police Department, since they're changing leadership now and things like that?
I hope so. Oh, do I see any change coming in Toledo with the new leadership? I hope so. I have not done my due diligence with looking at the new chief. From some of the things that I've seen him do, it seems like there's some positive things that could happen. The issue though is that when you've been a police officer for so many years, you just kind of do what's always been done and how you've been trained. And then you look at the research that's out there on, well, we need more police officers. Well, that isn't necessarily going to work. More police officers just means more of the same sometimes. And maybe we can work with less, but better trained and not working on these same issues all the time. Yeah. So we'll see. The problem is the other, you have to develop new responses. If we're going to get mental health professionals involved, then new programs have to be built. Like, when the DART program started, that was new. That was something that hadn't been done. And, it seems to be pretty successful. So it's just trying to get these new things going. Okay. I just did a little slide here on what can you do? Vote, many things. And this safer, more police will not make an area safer, nor less racially biased, but we need to have the proper training, focus on those priorities. I drove by a sign on the trail right before the zoo, and I glanced at it and I thought it was for the military. And then I looked closer and it was for the Toledo Police Department. You know, this is not protecting and serving, this is war. Demand police reform from your state representatives, your local police chiefs on changing those hiring requirements, training, and the police priorities. And then there's two bills. House Bill 84 was introduced this year, March 23rd, that allows an 18-year-old to be a police officer. That is a no, that is, can you imagine 18-year-olds carrying guns? And no, I don't even need to say anything more. And then this is my view here. House Bill 616 was introduced in April of 22, and it says you may not teach racist or LGBTQ concepts in schools. So it bans teaching divisive or inherently racist concepts. Everything I said tonight was divisive, inherently racist concepts. Critical race theory, which is a lot of the lens that I used through this was critical race theory, teaching about the systemic racism in our system and the history's impact on the system. Can't teach the 1619 project, DEI, learning outcomes. Oh man. This is the language I took right from the bill. Inherited racial guilt. I've never heard of that other than my cousin said, I don't want my kids to learn critical race theory because I don't want them to feel guilty. They shouldn't, they weren't there. Yeah, they weren't there. And then any concept that the board defines as divisive or inherently racist. And then teach, use, or provide any curriculum, instructional materials on sexual orientation or gender identity that is not age appropriate or developmentally appropriate. This is the same as the Don't Say Gay bill in Florida. I don't think anyone teaches anything that's not age appropriate on this, but unfortunately we have trans children in the elementary schools, and we have gay children. My son is a member of the LGBTQ community, and he really didn't learn anything while he was growing up about the community. So we're just starting to do these things, and now we're having laws that says you can't talk about it. Yes.
We have a question from someone at home, and they're asking if they have a family member with mental illness, how do they get a trained officer, and how many are there?
It would be nice if you could request a trained officer. Unfortunately, if one is not on duty, you will not get one. If an officer is, if a department has not had any officers trained, you will not get one. I was just lucky. And number one, I didn't call the police. My neighbor called the police because they heard glass breaking. I would not have called the police. I was just lucky that at that time, mommy police sent a very good officer to help. So I wish I could say you could request one, but I mean, you could say that, but I think my personal advice is try and de-escalate the situation yourself right now. Yes.
What would you suggest would be an alternative to calling the police? Do we have something in this county that would play that role? Is there some other emergency kind of thing that would?
There, yeah, I work with the Lucas County. Oh, are there other? if you can't call the police, what are the other options? We were just talking about this at Lord's the other day. Because most communities do not have many emergency resources, a lot of times individuals just end up going to the emergency room. That is difficult on the emergency room. They don't often have the resources. We used to have an organization called Rescue Crisis. When an individual was in crisis, they are no longer operating. That's where, as police officer, we would take individuals. There's not a lot right now for individuals in crisis. When I was a parent, I just learned myself what to do. And one of the things I had to do was grab my 180-pound child and just hold on to him, you know, learning some things yourself. And I also would have taken him to the emergency room before. So, yes.
One of the things that she just mentioned is a lot of people, when they see an emergency, they call the fire department.
Yeah, yeah. Some people call the
has those staff that many times come out with an ambulance, and many of them are trained, and more needs to be looked at in that area.
Are they? That would be nice. That would be very nice, calling the fire department with trained individuals. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
All right, great. Thank you.
The viewers at home, when we introduced our new member, missed her name. I'm so sorry. Could you share your name with us? Jenny Sullivan. Jenny, thank you, Jenny. I appreciate that.
And Kristin,
Yes.
we have a little something about it. Appreciate it.
Oh, nice.